Welcome back, everyone, to another video. Today's topic is going to be how does the Cold War kind of impact the home front in the early years after World War II? So really, what is it like at home during the Truman Administration with a lot of things going on? So I really like to start doing that with using context. So think about contextualization for a DBQ or an LEQ. This is one really good skill to help prep you for that, right? Thinking about what's going on in the world, how are these things going to impact things that are happening in the domestic front? A really good tool you can use is a little refresher. Check out the Butter Battle book if you haven't done so already by Dr. Seuss. Really good analogy for the Cold War and kind of some of the general problems at large. But let's start going into the real focus of today. First thing we can talk about is there's going to be a lot of social change that's going to happen throughout period 8. So there's a lot of context for that. So like, what is the background of these things happening? What's leading up to this? What may be causing this? We can also talk about things like continuity and change, where these ideas are going to split, where we're going to see some trends appear when we're talking about foreign policy, because we're definitely going to see some split in the next administration. And then causes and effects of something called the Red Scare after World War II. A huge part of American culture, and it's really going to impact a lot of things that are going on. And you may recall a first Red Scare in the United States in the 1920s. This one is much larger. It's much more infamous. There's a lot bigger things connected to it. We're talking about actual societal advancements, although there are some darker parts in the 1920s. You can compare and contrast those as well, but we're going to talk about post-World War II Red Scare. You can talk about different military responses, diplomatic responses, international developments that we'll kind of review as context. But we can also hit about kind of opposition to different policies that exist at the time period. Is it going to be more conformity or is it going to be more resistance? We can also talk about how this is really going to be shaping national identity throughout this time period, a development of a change over time. So before we get into this topic about what's happening on the home front, I want to talk about contextualization just really quickly. Contextualization would be kind of the things that are happening in the broader spectrum of the world that could be impacting life in the United States. So number one, we can do some quick review about Truman's Cold War that we've done so far. Maybe you've looked at the video on the Cold War in Europe or the Cold War in Asia, right? So we know about communism as a whole. Number one, think about kind of like a sandbox, right? Sand is cool and fine when it's at the beach. Sand is great when it's in the box, but it's not great when it's in your car or in your shoes or in your pants, I guess. No one would like that. That would be. Ultimately, containment. There are a couple different ways that we try to contain communism or keep the sand in the box. So the analogy I may have given before is if you have some soup, it's great when it's in a can or in a Tupperware container in your bag, but it's not great if you open up that can and pour it directly into your bag. So when we're talking about containment, there are political measures, there are military measures, there are economic measures. Right? Politically, we can talk about the Truman Doctrine. America will go to any corner of the earth, any democratic country that feels threatened, right? That term, threatened by communism, that we're going to intervene. Militarily, we have the development of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and we are going to try to create a military alliance across the globe. And one of the most effective ways that we have is something called the Marshall Plan, where we're going to flood Western Europe and democratic countries with money to help to try to prevent that turning of them towards communism. That's going to lead us to our very first incident in the Cold War, where things start to heat up a little bit, if you will, with the Berlin blockade. But again, the Cold War stays cold. We don't actually get into a violence. We solve this through airdrops of supplies, humanitarian means, right? We're dropping food like bread. We're dropping fuel. We're dropping other rations of need, including milk. Now we get ourselves into China. So there's other things that are happening. Europe is handled pretty effectively, and we accomplish our goals in Europe. In Asia, not so much. China has a revolution. The Chinese leader Mao Zedong has a revolution in China, successfully leads it, and China, in our point of view, falls to communism. And this is kind of like the communist Mount Rushmore, if you will, kind of the early founders. You have Marx, On the far left, you have Lenin in the middle, who leads the Soviets into their revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, and obviously taken over by Stalin, and now Mao in China. So, from the American point of view, we feel like we've lost China, that all is lost, that we could not have screwed this up anymore. We fear of this domino theory. The domino theory is that if one falls, the rest will fall. So America is really, really, really concerned that, oh God, China fell. What's next? What country is going to fall next? Is it going to be Korea? Is it going to be Vietnam? Is it going to be Laos, Cambodia? What's going to happen? If we don't stop this, all the rest of these countries are going to fall to communism. The rest of the world's going to fall in ruin. And it's going to be this kind of chain reaction effect. So the first country we immediately go to is so, in this incident, what happens is Soviet-trained North Korean troops invade the southern half of the southern half of the Korean Peninsula. South Korea was a democratic capitalist country. North Korea was a communist country supported by the Soviets and the Chinese. What happens is the North Korean forces invade South Korea. The United Nations and the U.S. mainly supplying those forces gets involved, and we push them all the way back up to the border with China in this counterattack. But the problem is the Chinese then get involved because they fear an American invasion. Our original goal is going to be a little bit subdivided. We have MacArthur, who wants a fully unified Korea, wants a single country, democratic country, right? That's going to be set up rather than two separate countries. He feels this is going to breed issues. Truman is much more concerned with international conflict and war, the World War III, if you will. So he's a bit more hesitant on action militarily. The Chinese are going to push back, and Truman is unable to actually solve this issue during his administration. And in comes Eisenhower, the general from World War II, the general from D-Day, who actually makes this a huge campaign issue going into 1952, wins the election of 1952, and is actually able to restore that 38th parallel line, an armistice line is created. And so that creates an end to the Korean conflict. So at the end of the day, yes, containment was held fast. We didn't do it with China. We lost China, it fell, but we stopped it from getting any worse in Korea. There are some big long-term effects here we can talk about, right? Because we're in Southeastern Asia now and we're really concerned with this, we get heavily involved with the French in a small country that we know as Vietnam, and it's eventually going to drag us into conflict, trying to prevent their communist leader, Ho Chi Minh, from leading a successful revolution in that country. Now, we come back home. So we're going to switch the domestic effects. It's going to be a lot shorter video today, but that should give us the context of a lot of things happening. This fear of expansion, the domino effect, all of these possible things going wrong. In Europe, we're good, but in Asia, we're not. And so we feel like we're losing a grip on things. The Soviets have already tested successfully an atomic weapon. We don't really know what's going to be happening here, and there's a lot of buildup of what's next, what's next, what's next. So with that context, let's dive into the home. So Truman is in office at the end of World War II, but remember, Truman doesn't get elected. In the election of 1944, FDR wins his fourth election in a row, but just after the Yalta Conference in February, FDR is going to die, and so he's going to take over as president. That term is going to last until the election of 1948. But in between, there are going to be the midterm elections that are going to cause some need, some desire, some push for change. Prices for Americans post-World War II immediately were not great. They were still very high. We didn't have a lot of consumer goods because we were so concerned with producing military goods that as the war is over now, we want to make that shift. And there's a little bit of an awkward, rough shift happening. We're not able to successfully do that right away. So you're going to have a huge problem because of the production is really slowed down from what it was, and there's not as many workers kind of turning things out. There's questions of who's going to keep these jobs. When the men come home, a lot of the women are going to be dispelled from their position so that the men can take these positions back over. Union members are going to go on strike. They want a larger share of the profits of what happened during the wartime, and these companies aren't necessarily providing them. And so there is a little bit of turmoil in the United States immediately following World War II. We're trying to transition from a full wartime economy back to peacetime economy, and that's a real rough patch. It's kind of like the middle school phase, the really awkward phase of trying to get back to a little bit of a status quo. Now, come 1946 is the midterm election, right? Every 2 years, there are elections for seats in the House of Representatives and in the Senate. And in 1946, Republicans take control of both the House of Representatives and the Senate. So understand what that means is they can push as much legislation as they want up. Now, they don't have that 2/3 majority in both houses, but they do control both houses. So if Truman wants legislation done, it has to go through Congress, and Congress is going to be blocking things left and right, left and right. There is this really big push in the campaign that have we had enough? Like to err is to Truman, to do wrong is to Truman, kind of connecting them almost in the same way that Hooverisms were used in the early 1930s. And they are going to be able to push through their own forms of legislation in Congress. They are going to push through something called the Taft-Hartley Act. It's breaking down unions. Remember, Republicans at this time are still very pro-business, a little bit laissez-faire economics, right? We're pushing away from that heavy government intervention, the heavy government control, which is what the Democrats, at least under FDR, now becomes this basis moving forward. And Republicans at this time are still not about that. They are not for it. So what they decide to do is they pass the Taft-Hartley Act, which is similar dealing with labor unions like the Wagner Act, but it's a little bit of an overturn of that. And it's forcing members to swear an anti-communist oath, right? Swearing an allegiance against communism, right? This is this new focus that we're putting into. It's implemented into all of these unions and telling them that these are the things we have to believe. We're not going to allow communism to be bred in our country to allow it to seep out. So we're going to start putting things in even at a smaller level, right? Or even in this case, a federal level inside these unions of workers of an anti-communist movement from the very beginning. But there's many other things that are really going to unfold here. Very shortly in the future, we get to 1948, which is an election year. Remember, Truman still hasn't won his own term. He's served for about 3 years, almost four, basically four. But re-election does not really seem possible or probable for Truman. Reason why, there's that really shaky transition out of World War II into that peacetime economy. It doesn't go well. And then in 1946, the midterms, the Republicans take over both houses of Congress. It's really not looking like, doesn't get a lot done. He tries, right, to bat off a lot of his competition. There's a huge Republican movement, a man named Thomas Dewey. There's a progressive candidate, and even someone we're going to call a Dixiecrat. Dixiecrats, you may have heard of like Winn-Dixie or Dixie being referred to as the South. Southern Democrats, Southeastern Democrats, which are going to be a very like staunch like states' rights going way back to like 1800s era, like trying to prevent a lot of this equality movements that are happening, especially after Brown versus the Board of Education. There is going to be a re-segregation movement, not a desegregation, but a re segregation movement. And so that's going to create a lot of issues. But there's division amongst the Democratic Party. There's a progressive candidate, Republican candidate. There's people all over the place. And really what happens is Truman just kind of goes out on a whim here and he just tries to lay it all out. He's going to go after the Republicans, saying the reason nothing was done was their fault when they were in control. He really tries to remind Democratic voters, especially, or all voters across the country, that Democrats were the one that got America out of the Depression. It wasn't the Republicans. Think of Hoover, right? Think of what happened then. So who got you out of that bad situation? Look at where we are now. The other thing that he's really going to do is he can't really be broken down on his issues in the Cold War because he hasn't had any failures yet. Anything that happens in Korea, anything that happens in Asia doesn't happen until about 1950. So these things have yet to have happened yet. All we know of right now is we know of the Berlin blockade, we know of the Marshall Plan, we know of the Truman Doctrine. So everything's going really well for him internationally. And kind of going back to this concept on that green little box up there of voters being reminded of what the Democrats did in the Depression. Think about it like waving the bloody shirt for the Civil War. That's one way you can connect kind of complexity. But all in all, the FDR coalition, that group of voters that FDR really pulled together, came in clutch for Truman. The laborers, farmers, the urban vote, the black vote kept Truman in office. But notice there's a lot of change going on here, right? We're going to have a lot of blue, of course, but there is a decent amount of red, a lot in the Northeast, right? Except for Rhode Island and Mass, right? Getting some votes there for the Republicans, the states' rights, the Democratic, the Dixiecrats down south, and even there is a progressive candidate that takes up a decent chunk of the popular vote. But he's still able to win enough states, keeps him in office, and there's one of the most iconic photos in U.S. history. Papers have to print their headlines ahead of time so they can deliver them early hours in the morning, so when people wake up, they can get the news. And most people didn't think that Truman had a chance at all. And so the Chicago Daily Tribune had already printed out their headlines when the results were being tallied, because people just assumed that Truman had absolutely zero chance, but the voters turned out in his favor. And so you see Truman right there holding up that newspaper that says Dewey defeats Truman, right? It's kind of that big uh-oh kind of headline that they really screwed up. But it's kind of one of these really great funny moments. But understand that it's really about voter pools. It's not, you don't really know what's going to happen until that voting actually goes through. We have an assumption, and even in this case, it's kind of an upset, really, even though he was the president that ended World War II and he was there at the end, right? There is really much an upset. So Truman is going to get 4 more years. The amendment still isn't in. It doesn't come until 1951 that's actually ratified that limits presidential terms. But there is still going to be kind of this understanding that Truman's probably going to step down. Truman really has 4 more years left. He doesn't run again in 1952, and so he really tries to extend what FDR did. He takes what both the Roosevelts did. Teddy Roosevelt with the square deal, everyone getting their fair share. Right? We're thinking back to the early 1900s, the Gilded Age, progressive era really beginning, and FDR's New Deal. So he uses that terminology to kind of hopefully reminisce people of what had happened and try to continue to build off these programs. He introduces his program known as the Fair Deal. He's really calling for an increase of the minimum wage, Social Security benefits, even national health insurance. This is not something new. A lot of people hear the news in the election of 2016 and 2020 about universal health care. This is not a new discussion, right? This has been going on for quite some time in the United States, but it really hasn't happened. We saw Obamacare, right, at the end of the early 2000s, beginning of the 2000 teens, but this is something different. So from there, we do see a lot of changes that he does extend, right? The fair deal, it's everybody's fair share about what's happening. The other thing he really tries to put into place is the Fair Employment Practices Commission, which is a way of ending discrimination against African Americans. He even desegregates the Army, which is huge. The Army was not desegregated in World War II. Executive orders allowed that segregation to continue. Brown versus the Board of Education hasn't happened yet. We had that Korematsu versus the United States case where Japanese Americans suing for their freedom and their rights during World War II and denied. But the thing we have going on here, not only does Truman face backlash from Republicans on the other side of the aisle, these Dixiecrats, these Southern Democrats are going to block all fair deal legislation. They are not going to gain back control of Congress on this issue. And so as a result, the fair deal doesn't really go through and dies out. So that's kind of the end of that discussion. The fair deal pretty much flops. But when we're talking about other effects that are happening, right, social effects that are going on in the United States, one thing that we can really look to is this fear of radicalism. Now, whatever that means, fear of foreign interference, ways of trying to remove that extremist view, right, from society in different ways, usually from a foreign aspect. In the 1940s, 1950s, absolutely no different. So what we're going to do is we're going to have our little Dora the Explorer moment where I'm going to have this really awkward long pause for you to think about, right? Try to come up with complex understanding examples, right? Are there any other times that you can think of in American history that Americans have reacted to foreign influence and tried to rid it from this country. They tried to pull that foreign influence out of this country. Take a minute. There's a couple different examples here, and you could use this if you had to write about this subject matter in a DBQ or an LEQ if you're talking about societal changes in a given time period. One great example that you have all the way back in period 3 is the Alien Sedition Acts used by the Federalists, especially the John Adams presidency. Then we can flash forward of this attack on foreigners, this attempt to remove these foreign ideas from our country in the 1850s with the Know Nothings, and then again the first Red Scare coming up right after World War I. So think about each one of these areas. In the Federalists with the Alien Sedition Acts, they're trying to remove French influence. John Adams' attempt is to try to keep America out of this conflict, this quasi-war with France. Here in period 5, we have the Know Nothings attacking foreigners, that fear of influence, the Catholics, the Irish especially flooding over to different centers. And then even after World War I, these radicals passing these ideas, this fear of attacks, especially after the Palmer raids, right? These are all different examples of this change. There's a couple different things that really spark this in the United States, though, this fear of communism, whether we're talking about the fall of China to communism, the USSR testing their atomic bomb successfully, spies in the United States when we figure out that these secrets for the atomic weapon have been leaked, and then also just this kind of paranoia and this fear that they could be anywhere and we don't know where they're going to be. So all these things really driving our decisions. So if you need some help on how to spot a communist, check out this link. I'll drop it in the description section below, but this is really going to help you in case you need it. You should really stop and take a look at that right now. This fear of radicals coming into the country is really going to take the form of the second Red Scare. And the second Red Scare is this desire to rid the country of communism because they feel that this is not only a political and ideological danger, but a physical danger as well, it could be. And it gets so large that even the United States government, our Congress, creates a committee specifically on this issue to rid the government of spies. This committee is called, and this is the real name, the House of Un-American Activities, or HUAC, H-U-A-A-C. They are going to interview and interrogate, rather, so many different people. And one of the most infamous cases in the United States is that of the Rosenbergs. The Rosenbergs are a really, really great story to understand. So what happens here is Julius, the man, was part of one of the espionage groups that allegedly stole the secrets for the Manhattan Project and sent it to the USSR. High stakes issue here, taking all that. He was the scientist on the team, found out to be a Soviet spy. Now, his wife Ethel was not she was not the spy doing the work and sending all that. All she did was she may have translated and sent this work back to Moscow, but she still was roped into this at the exact same level. Now, it's understanding that they both played a role to play, and Julius was given the death penalty. He was executed for leaking the atomic secrets, but his wife, for sending and transcribing those notes as well, she was executed, a husband and wife in the United States. And they didn't necessarily have mountains and mountains of evidence, but still they were convicted and sentenced to death and were executed. A loyalty review board is created that any government workers could be fired for, and I quote, a reasonable doubt. Anything that you just seem, you're acting too fishy, you're acting like a communist. There's all these questions about this individual. And so a lot of problems here could be a lot of he said, she said type of thing. So some people could legitimately believe these people are communists, or it could be for personal gain. Even the Justice Department jailed 11 members of the Communist Party, which was a legitimate political party or social organization in the United States, but didn't really take off after World War One because of the assaults and the fears of being deported and picked out after World War One, like during the Palmer raids, and that continues still here. But 11 different members were jailed for plotting an alleged socialist revolution in this country. All of these things are really coming out, and it's making a deeper story of the fear and the paranoia of what's going on. The best example of this is the leader of the House of Un-American Activities, or HUAC, is a Republican from Wisconsin by the name of Joseph McCarthy. McCarthy is a big name, don't forget him. Right? He is going to go on basically almost a 5-year crusade. I have here 4.5-year crusade going after communists. He has a list that he alleges he has over 200 names of State Department workers that he's accusing of being communists, that there are spies amongst us all throughout the federal government, and it's his job to go on this quest to rid them of this country. He is going to go after any government agency, especially even the State Department, of harboring spies, that there's men on the inside that are allowing this thing to happen. He is going to use a lot of different things to try to overwhelm the defendant's ability to respond and make them kind of every answer they give is wrong. That they is going to kind of have all this information, this case kind of already concluded before he steps into the door for these accusations, and just lay into these people. And they are going to accuse one person after the other after the other. They're even going to pull in Walt Disney and accuse him of being a communist spy in this country because of some cartoons that he made. Like, no one is safe. This whole era and this philosophy is called McCarthyism. It was this kind of easy, simple solution, but it wasn't necessarily the best. The easiest solution was that we have spies, we're going to rid them from our country. You're not American, you've got to be a communist. If we can defeat the enemy at home, right, then we don't have to deal with as many threats on the home front, and we're doing relatively well at this time abroad. We're going to avoid any major conflicts if we can keep them from infiltrating our country. We're not going to get involved in long, costly wars, and as great and lovely as that sounds, that's not really the case of how it works. You have all of these cartoons that will be depicting what's going on. This photo on the right is actually his McCarthy and his list of evidence that he says that there are communists inside the U.S. State Department, right? The Department of the State. And on the left, you have a wonderful cartoon. This is Eisenhower's nomination as an ambassador to Russia. Right? We have documentation proving that this man is planning a trip to Moscow. He must be a communist, and kind of this kind of silly back and forth. But a lot of people, by the end of this kind of McCarthyist fad, right after a couple of years into it, it's really going to die out, and he's going to kind of be looked at like a little bit of a loon. McCarthy, what's crazy about this whole thing is as long as McCarthyism lasts throughout this country and this fear, not a single communist was ever confirmed in the U.S. government. Never. And he never even had more than a 50% approval rating, but he was a loud, powerful movement in and of himself. And so he doesn't really get very far. He's going to have his own downfall. But the big thing to understand is that not everybody agrees with him. One great example is Arthur Miller's The Crucible. It's a play about the Salem witch trials. It's released in the 1950s. Some of you may have watched and seen the film adaptation or seen the actual play itself. And it's the story about the Salem witch trials, how crazy it is, and how people are just accusing people for personal gain, and really kind of the big facade of it all. And it's about the Salem witch trials. Or is it? A lot of people can use this, and it's a direct allegory. It tells two stories at once: the paranoia and the fear of the Salem witch trials, and compares it to what's going on in the United States. It tells the story, or it's a critique, a modern critique at its time, of what's happening in the United States. That all McCarthyism is a giant witch hunt. Really good way you can bring in, it's a tool. You can use this for the 1950s era if you're talking about the domestic policy as an example of outside information as good evidence to support some of your claims. So how does this massive McCarthyism phase die out? It's going to take until the Eisenhower administration. And really, when it comes down to it, the fear of communists is going to persist throughout this country, but not to the extent of the fear and the paranoia it was under McCarthy. Um, Eisenhower has a lot of great little quotes about McCarthy. Was not a huge fan. He says he's just going to provide just enough rope for this man to hang himself, right? That he's going to allow him to put himself kind of on television, and he says he's not going to get into a, and I changed the word here, peeing contest with a skunk, right? This guy's not even worth worrying over, right? He's going to implode upon himself. And that really happened. There's a televised hearing because a lot of people in the 1950s now have access to television. It becomes this kind of national phenomenon. And what's going to happen is he is going to go after the United States Army, going after generals, accusing them of being communists. And his whole kind of crazy, very belligerent, non really equitable style of investigation is really going to go on full blast. It's going to be factalist in a lot of cases. It's more emotionally based. Against the U.S. Army, that's never good in this country. Really, when it comes down to, at the end, just some kind of closing thoughts. The Cold War foreign policy was on the minds of a lot of Americans at the end of the 40s and early 50s. And successfully, for Truman, foreign policy was much, much better for him than domestic policy ever was. He never really had that same success. He never got his fair deal through. He faced a lot of opposition all the way through his time once World War II ended. So that didn't really go as well for him as everything else did. And then as you see this fear of communism grow internationally, it also is going to happen domestically and lead to a second Red Scare and McCarthyism, which also dies out. But these are trends that we're going to see being built off of. Where does America go from here? So as always, if you have extra questions, feel free to drop a comment down below. And if you need anything, let me know. Peace.